All right. Well, I think, you know what, well, for the sake of time, because I want to make sure I have time to talk with you all and take your input and suggestions, we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Happy Wednesday. We're halfway through the week. I'm really excited about our conversation today and share some tools and resources that we've developed here at the Iowa Environmental Council to help each of you understand pollution and climate and health data at the local level. This has been an exciting effort that's been a big team lift and super excited to share some of the information we put together with you today. So we'll start there with just kind of that overview. And then also just want to note that this is the third webinar in our Understanding Iowa's Changing Climate webinar series. This has been an initiative of our Climate Initiatives program, which seeks to help Iowans and the communities they call home prepare for the impacts of climate change and also focus on how Iowans' health is impacted by their environment. So been a really exciting series of conversations. I encourage you to go back to check out the other ones if you haven't already, but today's conversation will be just as fun and exciting. So I'm going to start with a little bit more about who the Iowa Environmental Council is. We are a statewide nonprofit organization. We're independent from the government. We're not a part of the state government. We're an independent nonprofit. That's often a misconception folks have about IEC. We are Iowa's oldest and largest environmental coalition, and we're very proud to celebrate our 30th anniversary this year. And we are made up of about 100 member organizations, from businesses like coffee shops and bike shops to corporations and others that care about the environment. We also have thousands of supporters across the state of Iowa who are individual members and supporters of the work here at IEC. It's important to me that we share some of the values that drive our work here at IEC. Our work is always informed by stories and science and data. As we do this work across the state, it's important that we understand sometimes our role is to educate and lead and provide resources, but more often than not, we learn from others and we follow their lead and we elevate success stories we find across the state of Iowa. Or as in this case today, we make the tools that make it easier for you all to lead on local issues. We are nonpartisan, we're inclusive, and we listen to others. To anybody who has a good idea, we're open book and open ears for partnerships and work together. So we pride ourselves on those values as well. And overall, our mission is a just, sustainable, and healthy environment for future generations of Iowans. So a little bit about me. I serve as the Director of Climate Initiatives here at IEC. I told you a little bit about that program. It's our newest program, a little over a year old here at IEC. Iowa State alum, go Cyclones. Sorry if you're a Hawkeye fan, I will let that pass. And then also I have a master's in climate policy from Indiana University. Go Hoosiers, they're having a better football year this year. So take that instead of the Iowa State football record we've got. My background has really been at the intersection between agriculture production, energy systems, and water systems and climate change. So how do those drinking water, wastewater, energy grid, agricultural production systems interact with our changing climate? And then more importantly, what can we do to prepare our communities and our populations for this type of change? And that's really what this program, this initiative, this webinar today is about, is that we are committed to helping communities and Iowans across the state adapt to more extreme weather, to floods, heat waves, droughts, and also understand that not every Iowan is impacted the same way. And everybody has a different starting point for where they're starting out when those things happen. So we have to recognize that in our response, in our planning, and all those efforts. So that's just a little bit more about me. So today's agenda, we have a couple of things. I'm excited to review IEC's climate change and environmental health map, which will be the main focus of our webinar today. And then I'm going to show you some snapshots of pollution, climate, and health information that we find on the map across Iowa. I've done my best to try to provide examples from Southeast Iowa, Northwest Iowa, and Northeast Iowa, all over the state. I see some cities and folks on here, so Clayton County and Davenport and others. I believe I have some examples that are going to be relevant to you, so that makes me happy to see that. And then also maybe a new approach here is I want to, at the end of the review of the map and sharing with you what those examples are and how you can use it, I want to hear from you about which communities I may not have had an example from and what you might want to see and look at, so we can work through some of that together. And I'll answer your questions at that point as well. So I mentioned the climate change and environmental health map. These are 3 screen grabs And you can access it through this QR code here. We're going to have plenty of ways for you to access that. And Sarah, I may ask if you can just drop the link at some point in the chat for the map if you get a minute, and maybe that landing page for the map, but we'll walk through all that as well. So what is the climate change and environmental health map? This is a web-based interactive map that has combined several federal data sets on climate, health, pollution, economic issues across the state of Iowa. And they are basically from two data sets which are no longer publicly available from the federal government. The first of which is the EJ Screen tool that was available through the EPA. And the second was the Climate and Economic Justice Screening tool that was available through the Council on Environmental Quality, which is an executive office through the White House. And you may be familiar with their Justice 40 initiative from the prior administration. This was a sort of spanning thing from that. So what we did is a little less than a year ago, we took all the data down from those sites and we spent a lot of time putting it into an interactive web-based tool. So what it represents is the best available science, data, and information that we have nationwide about Iowa's climate change, environmental health indicators. So we'll talk more about what that looks like. But that's what the map is. So how can you use the map? I wanted to pull this out, just a couple of things here. So I know for those of you on this call, I would imagine some of you are city or county or state government officials. Some of you might be community organizers or just interested folks trying to figure out where pollution is in your community and how climate change might impact the people in your neighborhood. I wanted to pull out where I think this map can be most useful and where I've seen folks use it over the past 10 months. Some of those include grant writing. So if you're looking to apply for grants and you want to know how bad is the air pollution in our community, or I'm near a Superfund site, or am I at risk of flooding over the next 30 years? All of those types of things are what's on the map here, and that can help strengthen your grant applications, and you can cite the underlying federal data sets for that. That is the point I'll continue to make. IEC did not develop any of the data sources. We aggregated them and isolated it from a national level to the state level. And then instead of having it in a list format like they used to have on the federal websites, we made it into this interactive map with color coding. So you could kind of see where the hotspots were at the local level. Other uses include community organizing. If you're concerned about wastewater discharge in your community from industrial facilities, this will give you an idea of where your community might stand on a national scale. And then identifying those sources of pollution. What are the things you should be worried about for your kids, your pets, your families in your local neighborhoods? This is a good tool for getting your head around what potential risks to your health might exist. And then also, if you're on the environmental health or planning side, or even local officials, this might be helpful in identifying how to more effectively plan for your environmental projects at that scale. So understanding your flood risk if you're a planning official and somebody proposes to develop housing in the floodplain. If you want to figure out as a school official, is the local Superfund site posing a risk to our students' health? Well, there are tools on here you can use to figure out how far away they are and where they're at and how many there are. So all of these tools, I think, can be really helpful in project planning. So on the use of the map, you see these two documents that I've screen grabbed here for your review. This link, and we'll share the slides out afterwards, goes to the map itself. And it has on that page listed both an EJ codebook and a user guide. Essentially, this map is a lot of information. It took a lot to build it. It takes a lot to use it. And it just, there's a lot of information here. So in an effort to make it less overwhelming, I developed two of these tools that are meant to assist you as the user in making it easier. The first one is this spreadsheet behind with all these categories here. That is the codebook. What I did is I downloaded all of the definitions from the federal databases for every layer. And you can kind of see these color-coded things over here: pollution, economic, EJ. This is the order that they appear in on the map, but I have coded them to be pollutions in a block. The economic stuff and demographic info is down here in a block, that sort of thing, with two exceptions, because I think it's important to be able to overlay. Was it considered a disadvantaged community, which we'll talk about here in a second? And then is it considered to be a low income community? Because that helps contextualize some of these environmental risk factors that we see. The other document here that you see is a user guide. And that user guide is essentially trying to help you as the user have the easiest experience possible. Because I know the tool because I built the tool, right? But you all weren't a part of that process, didn't see how to make it load faster or how to use the layers most effectively or the tools, that sort of thing. So this document is just a user manual. It is meant to help you kind of understand how to ensure that it's more functional. And since there's so much information, some things like the amount of layers on there can make it slow to load. And this just shows you how to make that faster, and then how to view certain layers and how to use the tools, that sort of thing. So I just wanted to flag that as two resources that are really important for you all if you're thinking about using the tool. So I mentioned the term disadvantaged communities before, and I wanted to take a second to talk about how we define disadvantaged communities. So we have sort of three buckets here. This is a lot of information, but I'm going to start over here on this right side, environmental justice, climate pollution indicators. Our map includes all of this, but starting on the right side over here, ozone pollution, flood risk, PM 2.5 particulate matter in the air, so air pollution, expected loss of agricultural products due to climate disasters and energy burden. Those are all kind of in this bucket. These are some of the environmental things that are happening. There are environmental justice, for example, the energy burden is how much of your income every year you spend on your electricity bills. Those sorts of things that provide context to where pollution is at. And then the second one is the economic indicators. You know, is the area an area of high poverty? Are there a lot of kids that are in poverty? Is the unemployment rate elevated? What is the area annual median income? And then this left side one, the percent of the population below 200% of the federal poverty line, is what the federal government defines as a poverty community. And so a low income community. So that really helps us understand what types of resources at the household level or the city level or the county level are available for mitigating pollution, responding to climate change, helping improve health outcomes related to the environment. So that's the second bucket of things here. And then this third one is added in as well, which is demographic indicators. You'll see on this map and you'll see through these conversations that in Iowa, it's often that we are painted with a broad, pretty generalized brush about our racial makeup, our demographic makeup. We have a lot of demographic and racial diversity across the state of Iowa. And this map demonstrates that. It has all of these indicators about different ethnic and racial groups, and also other things that are not on here, age, percent of the population over 65, that sort of thing. What I view this as is adding more detail about who in the state is most vulnerable for pollution, for climate change impacts, extreme weather. All of these things can be really useful in being more prepared for when the next flood hits or when the next derecho hits. All of these things that help us have better information and insight into our communities about who is where and who is most vulnerable. So this is all together, these different indicators help us define what disadvantaged communities are. So for example, if there's heavy air pollution and it's low income and there's existing rates of asthma and most of those people in that neighborhood are Black or African American, that would be something that we would define as a disadvantaged community. Not because one of those things, but because all of them together paint a picture of who's most vulnerable. So I hope that makes sense, and I'm happy to answer questions about it. So that just provides the color and context for that terminology around the climate change and environmental health map. So now I'm excited to dive in on what's on there. So you may have seen some of these on that spreadsheet, but to review, there are 14 sources of environmental pollution, including some of the following, including industrial air pollution, wastewater discharges from industry and wastewater treatment facilities, emissions from transportation. So for example, here in Des Moines, where IEC is based, we have Interstate 235 that goes through the downtown core. And along that, you see very elevated rates of diesel particulate matter pollution, which comes from exhausts from vehicles, semis, that sort of thing. Electricity generation, like coal plants, in Sioux City, there's 2 coal plants. And so that plays a role there. Toxic waste sites, where are those at in the state and who is most vulnerable to those? either now or if there's an accident or an extreme weather event that makes it more likely. And that also includes Superfund sites, which are contaminated brownfield sites, usually have some type of contaminants that have been identified by EPA in the groundwater or in the soil or in both. And then some of the things, there might be some folks on the call that are county sanitarians or adjacent to that type of role who are responsible for helping identify or clean up things like leaky underground storage tanks, which maybe was a former gas station. That's actually on here as well. So we wanted to be pragmatic about what sources of pollution exist and then how they may contribute to negative health outcomes for Iowans across the state. So that's one sort of category of things here. Here's one example of what this looks like. Now I'll note that the first example you'll see is this very pretty graphic that Sarah put together, and the next one's just a screen grab of the map. So she did a better job of making it more presentable, but this is one of the nice ones here. So this first one is percentile for toxic releases to air, which the EPA has defined as the risk of developing respiratory cancers as a result of toxins released from industry into the air. And what you can see is that across the state of Iowa, these darker brown areas, it says 80 to 100. These numbers, and you'll see them throughout, these are percentiles. So basically the way I describe this is for this indicator, percentile for toxic releases to air, we have the one on this end, which would be the first percentile or the 0, that has the least amount of releases of toxins to the air that are at risk of developing respiratory cancers. And then on the 100th, we have the worst in the country, right? So what we see here is that a lot of metro areas, including the Des Moines area, as is pointed out in this call out, the Cedar Rapids area up north of Mason City, over in Davenport, Sioux City, Omaha, most of our metro areas. And then in addition, plenty of our rural or mid-sized towns are up between the 80th and 100 percentile nationally for this indicator. Something interesting for public health officials to know and for communities to prepare, especially when we're talking about groups with sensitive respiratory systems, like those that have asthma or COPD or lung cancer. So that's one example. This is another example I mentioned, the fancy graphics are Sarah's, this was my contribution. And this is the Superfund one. So I will just make a point here that is going to be relevant throughout the rest of the webinar. So you kind of see these layers over here, and this is what the dashboard looks like. What you're seeing on the screen are these purple sort of, and you can see the boundaries between them. These purple areas are census tracts. And these census tracts show us, in this case, the number of Superfunds, where they are, the Superfund sites in each block group. Sorry, I said census tract. These are block groups. So they're a little bit smaller than census tracts. But there's one here, there's one there, there's one here, there's one up here that's highlighted, it's kind of hidden by the box, and there's one down here. This is in the Burlington area. So this is actually the highest concentration of this. You'll notice on these layers, there was one that's right above it that's also about Superfunds. And this one is the census tract level. And it's less about how many Superfund sites are in the census tract and how many are there and where are they at. It's less about that. And it's more about overall which communities are closest to these types of facilities at a larger scale. So the value in combining the CGES tool and the EJ screen data set was that you can see both, right? And before we made this map, that wasn't possible. You could see the proximity on the CGES tool, or you could see where the Superfund sites were on the EJ screen tool. What we've done here is we've combined them both into one tool. So if you're a community leader, a community organizer, a city or county official, you can use this tool to figure out with levels of specificity that weren't available before, in this case, on Superfund sites. So that's one other example, and you can kind of see the lists of other things there as well. We also thought it was really important to include climate change indicators, and 6 of the most common and expected impacts of climate change in Iowa are on this map. That includes flooding, fire risk, the loss of agricultural products and value due to extreme weather, and then unfortunately mortality, death from extreme weather, and the loss of buildings and structures from extreme weather. So those are all on this map as well. And basically, the way that the federal government figured this out, because again, this is federal data, is they use the Federal Emergency Management's Natural Hazards Risk Index, and they look at the projected extreme weather impacts over the next 30 years. And then they decided, between those risks, who's most at risk? Is it buildings, agricultural products, people, that sort of thing? So I don't think it's a surprise to anybody in Iowa that flood risk is extremely elevated. You can see that legend at the bottom right. Those again are percentiles, the 75th to 97th percentile nationally, meaning 97th is the highest that we see in the state of Iowa, which is why it ends there. And these dark blue areas, you can see that's in the Des Moines metro. This one right here, just south of downtown, is 93rd percentile. I know that there are some in downtown Sioux City that are 91st, 92nd, and 93rd, but you can see it's not just an urban issue. And Cedar Rapids, of course, it looks a little bit light there, but once you zoom in, it's sort of like this call out here. But also most of the state is above the 50th percentile for flood risk. There might be some lighter areas throughout, but by and large, flood risk over the next 30 years is an expected impact of climate change that we've already experienced on what seems like a yearly basis now. I'll point out that Spencer, that was up in Clay County, I believe is this one here, don't quote me, but it's in the census tract here, which is among the highest as well. And you may remember they had severe flooding in 2024. One that I wanted to put in here because folks don't necessarily associate it with Iowa is the risk of wildfire over the next 30 years. This was something as I was building this map that was surprising to me. I did not expect that some communities in Iowa, particularly near and around Sioux City, and in the western part over here in the Les Hills region, and then in the south central part, and then some of these other hotspots here, 83rd to 99th percentile for the risk of wildfire. Now, what I've noticed in anecdotal examples and news stories around the state, we have a lot of grassland fires that happen around the state that are somewhat easily put out after a day or so from a local fire department or those sorts of things. But you can kind of line up the landscape with the risk here. So the Les Hills area, the grasslands here, drier, sandier soils, that sort of thing. And it's sort of the same over here. So that's interesting for us to think about. Environmental health is another category of things that are in this map. And basically, we're looking at the pollution, the climate risk, existing health conditions, the things that directly contribute to negative health outcomes for Iowans. And regardless of whether or not these things like pollution in the air from a coal plant cause chronic health conditions, they make them harder to live with. And so, for example, let's use the wildfire smoke example. That's particulate matter 2.5 in the air from the Canadian wildfires this summer. Seems like every summer now we have those. But then if you have asthma, it's not caused by the wildfire smoke, but it's a heck of a lot harder to deal with that if you've got asthma, COPD, or lung cancer than it is for somebody who's young, healthy, and does not have respiratory illness. So that's just one example. And let's look at it. There's going to be a couple of videos here. I recorded them myself, so they might be a little bit off from what I'm saying, but I'll point out as we go. So this is one example of asthma and PM 2.5 pollution. So this is the Davenport area. The red area, these are the asthma rates. This is one of the highest asthma rates area in the state. And this is PM 2.5. This is also the highest 10 census tracts for particulate matter pollution in the state of Iowa, are all right here, along with some of the highest asthma rates in the state. Now, that's not on a county level. If you're looking at county level, Woodbury County and Sioux City has the most. But the census tract level, these are among the most diverse. Census tracts, they have the highest levels of asthma and the highest levels of air pollution. So if you're a community planner or somebody who's in public health or somebody who just cares about these people, it's important that we recognize that their sensitivity to these things are much greater, and they're at greater risk of developing other chronic illnesses as a result of this pollution. So that's one example you can see on the map. This is one I just found yesterday that I wanted to talk through a little bit. Sorry for the little blur here. Again, I'll just point out before I hit play on this video, here are those legends. These are percentiles, again, at the national level. This one here. And then this one is actually percent of the census block group that meets this criteria, which is 8 under 5. So for example, this top one would be like 25% essentially of that census block group would be children under the age of 5. So for this one that's clicked here, there are, of that census tract, a census block group in Sioux City, 13% of the people that live there are under the age of 5, which as you can see from the legend, pretty high comparative with the rest of the state. Now on the left side here, what we have is what's an indicator for Pre-1960s housing, it's a proxy indicator for lead paint exposure. We know that children are most at risk for lead paint. So if you're doing lead paint mitigation activities as a county public health official, or working to make sure that kids how to figure out what's behind elevated levels in kids' blood, you can see this very dark complexion of the highest levels of lead paint exposure. But you can see that for those kids in this census tract, which is the highest in the area, they would be the most vulnerable. So if you're trying to design programming, intervention efforts, you may be better spent and better served, and resources better spent by targeting the areas with more children. So that's one example of how this map can be useful in demonstrating those relationships between the environment and our health. There's another category of things on here, and we've seen this already, but just to reiterate, there are some racial and socioeconomic groups in the state of Iowa that are inherently more at risk, and that is because of their economic status, historic racism, the location of where they live, if they're next to polluting facilities, or if they're in formerly redlined neighborhoods. All of these things are a part of Iowa's history, and they show up today in our environment. And another example would be language barriers. So let's look at what some of those things look like. This is what's called the housing burden. Essentially, again, these are the percentiles, and you can kind of see across Iowa, it's not all that high, but then if you look through the metro areas, you can kind of see Davenport, Cedar Rapids is the same story, Des Moines is the same story. What we see is that in our college towns, especially Iowa City and Ames make up, and in Cedar Falls, those are actually the highest for housing burden because of college students. You're not considered to be housing burdened at all until your housing cost exceeds 30% of your annual gross income. So what we see here is that for a lot of these areas, including basically all of central Des Moines, the housing burden is really difficult. And that just means that these people, let's say there's a flood, these people are already paying 40, 50, 60% of their income on housing. It's going to be really challenging for them to relocate. So we need to have that context to be able to design the right programming, whether it's around community resilience hubs and having a place for them to go during that time, even if it's just to charge a phone, or perhaps if they have a medical device, because a lot of these folks might be elderly and have existing chronic disease. They need to be able to charge that battery pack or plug in their dialysis machine or whatever it might be. We have to make sure that they have access, and this is helpful for us having that context. Another environmental justice indicator that's on here is what I mentioned earlier, energy burden. This is the share of your annual adjusted gross income on your energy bills. This includes utility bills, and I believe it also includes transportation fuel like gas. And what you can see is that nationwide, there's a lot of elevated energy burden across the state in comparison with the rest of the country. So this purple is the best example. That's at the minimum 75th percentile nationally, higher than 75% of the rest of the country. And that's a very rural issue that we see. There are some areas in Des Moines that we actually don't see anything get above the 80th or so. Sioux City is about, I think the highest is in the 70s and 80s. What we see is that in Northeast Iowa and in Dubuque in particular, it gets really high. This is an example from Fayette County. This first indicator, it's always going to be the first line, even if it has a weird acronym. This is energy burden, 96th percentile. That's just how all of these are going to look. And you can kind of see that, well, if you line it up with service territories for utilities, since the alliance service territories sometimes is higher because as a share of income, people are paying more. And then rural electric cooperatives in that area tend to have a higher rate as well. So that's another example of how knowing these things about your community can help design programs, services. And then there's just a variety of other layers and information that I wanted to shout out. There's more than, I think there's 49 layers exactly on this map. And those are kind of all the layers of the data. And we also know that the impacts are not the same, as I've mentioned a few times. So the other information includes more on the economic conditions, racial breakdown, chronic health conditions, like some of the conditions I mentioned before, but that's on there. So here's one other example about health and demographics. So what we see here is on the left side, the percent of people of color in the census tract. So this is downtown Des Moines, and I'm going to point out this one right here. I'll do it in the video too. And you'll see that the highest people of color percent for a census block group in Des Moines is 96%. There are some very heavy communities of color, and that's the point I was trying to make as well at the beginning, is that we have very diverse pockets in our metro areas and in our rural areas. So that's just one note. That's what's on the left side here. And then the other side is percent low income. These are the folks that are more than 200% below, at or 200% below the poverty line. So that's that poverty indicator that the federal government uses. We see that we have some very high levels of that as well. 98th percentile kind of over through this area. This would be like the East Village area. It's pretty low, but you can see even that disparity to go from 18% are in poverty here to at least 54% over here. There's some massive disparities there. So I'm going to play this video and just kind of show you this relationship. This is a swipe function on the map. So I'm just kind of showing you the layers here, the people of color, the percent low income. You can take this bar and you can just use it as an analysis tool. So again, I'm going to ask you to keep your eyes on this one. Very high percentage of people of color and also very low income. And this is near the Drake University campus. It's a Drake neighborhood. There's another example here in the Riverbend area, which is very diverse and very low income as well. So what we're seeing is 25% of the people there are low income, 58% of the people there are low income, and at the same time, at least 50% of them are people of color. But this can help you understand more about your communities. I want to show a couple of helpful tips for you using this map. And just to note, like, it does take some time to load. So if you're getting on there, it's just so much information. There's really no real way around it. And I'll show you some tips about when we go to actually use the map to make it more useful for you. But here's one helpful tip relating to proximity to Superfund sites. You can see I have that layer on. It's displayed across the state, and these are census tracts. It's not exactly the outline of where the census, the Superfund sites are, but which communities are most at risk by being surrounded. You can see one over here in Newton. What I've opened here at the bottom is I click these three dots and I clicked the attribute table function. So I'm just gonna like go back a little bit to that. So I put view and attribute table. This is just a helpful tip here. So what it does is it pulls up the table from the bottom, as you saw there. And this is, again, what you're seeing on the map, but it's in table format. So as somebody who wants to figure out, okay, where is it the worst? I'm going to click on this indicator and it's going to bring up this ascending or descending. Well, if I'm looking for highest to lowest, I'm going to click on the descending, which I'll do next. And since the whole state is in view, I can see that, okay, this is the highest, most at risk. And I click that zoom to, and this is the area of the state that has the highest proximity to Superfund sites. And I zoom back in. As you zoom in, it kind of isolates to what's in the screen. But here's the second highest. It's in Black Hawk County. So I hit zoom to. I know off the top of my head that these two census tracts also happen to be the two most heavily Black census tracts in the state of Iowa. And they're the second highest for proximity to Superfund sites. And you can see this number, again, that national percentile is 99th percentile in the entire country, meaning this area of Waterloo, that area of Cerro Gordo County that we just looked at, are the highest in the country for proximity to Superfund sites. Again, showing that here in Iowa, we have some serious challenges. So that's an example there on how to use this tool a little bit more effectively. That's like an insider tip. And then here's another one for you about using the measurement tool. So we just looked at these two census tracts in Waterloo. And now what I've done is I've changed it from the proximity to the Superfund sites, which was kind of that overarching, everything has something. For the number of Superfund facilities, I got rid of anything that didn't have anything. So it only shows where they have Superfund sites. Well, that's these two that we just looked at in the last example. So let's say I live here in this community and I want to understand how far this Superfund site is from somewhere else in the community. We see that this tells us there's one there. Okay, let's use this tool. So we're going to open up the measurement. I'll do like the distance one first. And I'm just going to pick a random spot on the map here. But I clicked here and I wanted to see how far it is from there. When you're done with it, you're supposed to double click. And so I forgot to do that, which is why it's weird here. But You can just kind of see, you can trace a path, and it shows you the mileage there, just to slow that down a little bit. So 2.73 miles if I were to take that path. And then the other tool that's present in the same one is this tracing tool that gives you kind of the area. So you can trace it. How big is this thing? And I want to know how many acres of Superfund sites I have. And at the end, I double click, and it gives me the fact that I have 193.3 acres. That's a tool that I can use. Some practical applications of this, I believe this is a school over here. You want to figure out how far away the actual Superfund site is. Or, if I'm a water utility and I've got, this looks like a wastewater treatment facility down here, is that plausibly polluting some of the source water that we have, that sort of thing. This is a tool that's helpful for you to understand that relationship. Okay, so that was a lot of information. And so I'm actually going to stop here, and I want to turn it over to you. And I'm going to see 12:36. I love that we have this much time. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a bit, and I'm going to look at some of the questions in here. But then I want to hear from you. What communities do you want me to explore, and what indicators are you interested? So the first thing that I see here on questions, do these maps identify CAFO locations? They do not identify specific CAFO locations. That was not included in the federal data that we had from the federal government. I will say this blue one that you just saw on the screen before was a wastewater discharge one. And I believe that CAFOs of a certain size that are required to have a permit are in that category. So yes, to some extent, but not specific locations. Okay. If you have other questions, put them in the chat. But at this point, I will just ask folks to drop in which communities you want me to take a look at. And at that time, I will also pull up the map and show you how to access it. So while I'm waiting on those to come in, I'm going to show you how to access the map on our website. So let's see if I can get this going. All right, so this is the Iowa Environmental Council homepage, ieaenvironment.org. And so what you'll do from here is you'll go to this Our Work section. Climate Initiatives and Community Resiliency is this program. If you click it, it'll take you to this page. And on this paragraph, you'll see this climate change and environmental health in Iowa map. You'll click that link. It'll take you to this page. And this is kind of what I showed you in the presentation. This is where you want to access the map, because it's where you can click to access the actual map, but it's also where you can click and download the guidebook, which is, we'll download this for you. So this is how that looks. You can kind of see all of those things. This is everything that's on the map. So there are 49 indicators, all of the categories, the source it came from, the federal definitions, all of it. So that's all aggregated there. And then the user guide, which you saw some screen grabs of, and I forgot to open, so I don't want to go through my files and everything while you guys are waiting, but that's there as well. So if you click access the map, it's going to take you to this page here. And this is what the map looks like when it's fully loaded. And so this is kind of, you want to make sure you can view most of the state most of the time. So this is every layer on. I kind of best describe this as a sandwich. So what you see on top is like the top layers in this order, which you can see here. So the red one, those little dashes, those are the disadvantaged communities, okay? Is low income, it has a red outline. Underneath that, that's that uppermost visible layer where everything else is, that's the particulate matter and the air pollution. And I mentioned those things about Davenport having some of the highest over here. So the best advice I would give you when you start with the map is go to this little icon here. So hit the layer button, go here and turn them all off, because that's a ton of information. Every time you zoom, it's trying to like reload it, and sometimes the map will crash. I'll just be honest with you. So I would just recommend doing that. So for example, just to illustrate the PM 2.5, so I'm going to zoom in over here. And I know from our work that these areas in Davenport, 70th percentile, and just a note, the highest we have is 74th. 70th, 71st, 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 72nd, kind of that top of the pack. Now we looked at those asthma areas here. I believe it was This one here is at the 71st percentile. You can kind of see some of those things. Just a note on using the map there. All right, so I'm going to go back over to your suggestions. Okay, let's look at Wenatchee County. So if you want, you can put the data in here. Make sure I spell that right. So you can just type in Wenatchee County. It's going to take you up here. And I'm just going to pick some random things based on what I think could be a thing up here. So let's look at percentile for toxic releases to air. Pretty low up here, 10th percentile, 7th percentile, 11th. Over in Cresco, it gets up to the 48th, but pretty low nationally. It's an older town in Decorah. Yep, so leaky underground storage tanks, 60th percentile and 54th nationally. Proximity to Superfund sites, also pretty low. Hazardous waste sites might be a different story, yeah, a little bit higher. And then we'll see here that it lists how many hazardous waste facilities are in a group. Again, the value of combining these data sets. Proximity to risk management facilities. These are basically facilities that have some type of hazardous material on site, and they have to have a permit in place about what they would do if a disaster struck. So what you'll see, I'll zoom out from Wenatchee County, but you can see it's a pretty widespread thing here in Iowa. It doesn't necessarily mean they're dangerous. It just means if something happens, they could be dangerous. So let's see, I think maybe travel barriers would be pretty high. Yeah, this is a score based on how difficult it is to get around. You can imagine that some of these more rural areas have that 81st percentile. I bet this one's going to be really high. This is older housing with lead paint as a proxy. Yeah, so you can kind of see over here in Spillville, Fort Atkinson, 79th percentile. I'll just zoom out and note that what we see here is something really interesting on a statewide level. So lots of rural areas have older housing with the higher risk of lead paint, right? But what we'll notice, so do the center of metro areas. So that's Des Moines. Notably, the suburbs, which have exploded in the Des Moines metro recently, do not have that same problem. We see the same thing in Cedar Rapids, and I guess we probably see the same thing in Davenport. Yeah, so the historic areas are obviously more at risk for those types of things, which makes sense. Okay, so there's that. Let's look at Sioux City. All right, there are a couple of interesting relationships up here that I'd love to show you. So I'm going to, well, here's the energy burden. And you can see, as I mentioned, 68th percentile. The rates up there are pretty low comparative with the other side of the state. There's something, okay, yeah. So this is the red line, historically red line neighborhoods. So you can see that this is something that was very much happening in Sioux City. At the same time, what I like to do is so I put on the redlining and I put on the flood risk. So I'm going to show you how to use this swipe tool. So I'm swiping away the redline communities, but what you can see is it's not always perfect, but right up in here, let's look at this one, for example, it lines up pretty well. High flood risk, and redline community. That can mean just the way that the land falls, the age of the housing stock, you just never know. But typically those communities which have had less of an opportunity to build wealth would have less resources and investment in stormwater infrastructure and that sort of thing too. So you can start to draw some of those relationships as well. I'm going to turn that one off. And let's see here. This is one that stuck out to me. This is low life expectancy. So basically, if you're higher, you can expect to live shorter. This is like, who has the shortest life expectancy. 91st percentile nationally. I'll note that the coal plants near Sioux City sit right here. Not necessarily attributable, but also certainly doesn't help the problem. 87th, 79th percentile, 80th, 90th. So this is one of those where when I'm looking at something like this, I always want to take a zoom out to the whole state, and I'm going to use that attribute table tool that I told you about. So I click those three dots, and I'm hitting view in the attribute table. I'm going to zoom out, make sure I can see the whole state so it doesn't crop anything out for me. And then I'm going to go to the indicator, and I'm going to do descending highest to lowest. Sometimes it gets a little bit wonky, but what we see here is that the highest for low life expectancy is in Marshall County. I'm going to zoom to it. This area has the lowest life expectancy in the state of Iowa and is also 98th percentile nationally. Why? I don't know why that area of Marshalltown would be like that, but you can start to maybe look through some of these other things. Is it diesel particulate matter? That's not enough to explain it. Ozone's not that high. Toxic releases to air, sure, that gets a little bit higher. Wastewater discharge, okay. But ultimately, it's hard to tell. It is really hard to tell as you go through, but it's interesting to know, and it can provide some examples to take to your leaders of your communities and say, we deserve better than what we have now. Okay, so I went to Winnebago County. I went to Sioux City. Concerned about the two Waterloo areas that you showed for cancer and the Chamberlain munition site. Yeah, let's go back to that. Waterloo has a lot of these challenges. So, the only true cancer risk thing that we have on this map that's explicitly saying cancer is this percentile for toxic releases to air. So this is the area in Waterloo that we were looking at, 85th percentile for those releases to air that could potentially cause a respiratory cancer, 85th percentile. Now, as I mentioned when I showed this earlier, this is a problem all over the state. Now we've looked at the Superfund site, and it's actually a proposed Superfund site with the Chamberlain site because it takes forever to get that listed. But the proximity you can see is super high, 96th percentile, and then the number, which just basically shows you where in the state we have Superfund sites, and that's where that Chamberlain site would be at. Now I will note two other things here. Redlining, obviously something that we would expect in this community with its history. And then the Sarah properties at risk of flooding. These are very high. So I guess I'll just show this relationship. Let me put on percent people of color, and I've got flood risk on too. So what we can see is we can start to swipe through where's the flood risk the highest, and is it where people of color live. So let's look at these two, knowing that those are the two highest census tract for Black Iowans. It doesn't always align, right? So it could be elevation. So some of these relationships can be complicated to display, but we do know that, for example, if I leave on people of color and then do an economic one, percent low income, for example, we see these relationships track a lot more closely. So very fascinating relationships here. Thanks for pointing that one out. Look like Wayne County has a lack of housing issue. Let's go to Wayne County. And Sarah, as I'm going through these too, I know that you have also seen a lot of the things on here too. So if you have anything that you want me to point out, definitely let me know. Okay, so let's look at the housing burden. So this is the share of your income that you pay on housing. And we see that, oops, it's on. You gotta make sure you're looking at one at a time or it gets wonky like that. Okay, so this is the housing burden. And we know that this is between the 50th and 70th percentile. I don't know why it's being a pain like that. Here we go. 70th or 71st percentile for housing burden. So this obviously is an area where people's income, a large portion of that is going to housing, and therefore also demonstrating it's not just an urban issue. I was just noticing this Ottumwa one over here as well, 80th percentile. And, usually this tracks with where people have less income, right? If you have a low income, you're going to spend a lot of that income on housing because you need a place to live. Okay, let's get back to some of these Q&As. Winnebago County, okay, we'll check that one out again on the poverty rate. I always forget how to spell Winnebago County. Please don't judge me for that one. Okay, so this is the housing burden up here, 53rd percentile. And again, this is in comparison with national. One point, I'm just going to turn this back on. The colors compare across the state. So the hot spots are the hot spots in Iowa, right? But the numbers are always comparing to the federal data. So it's the national percentile, just a note there. Okay, so poverty in Winnebago County. Let's see here. Just looking through, there's a ton to pick from. Let's look. Okay, so here is what the federal government uses as living in poverty. For just a percent of individuals below 200% of the federal poverty line. Relatively low in um, relatively being the operative word in these rural areas. This is a massive disparity. Okay, so looking at this one, what it shows us here, this is a percent, and 39% of the people in that area are living in low income. And then you go here in Decorah, and it's 2%. It's a massive difference. And so if I zoom out, you can see a lot of these low income areas. So this one is in Butler County, 80%, 77. Fort Dodge has a lot. As you would expect, you can kind of see some of these metro areas, but this looks like Ottawa over here. Yeah. So Ottawa maybe would surprise some people. I used to live over in this area. Yeah, and then some of these South Central counties, rural poverty is a huge problem in our state. So just really interesting ways. And then another thing that I like to look at is percent of individuals age 25 or over with less than a high school degree, meaning they did not finish high school. You can see that Iowa, relatively compared with the rest of the country, we have a better education system in a lot of places, but there are definite hotspots. So let's look at Storm Lake. 35% of the people that are over the age of 25 in that census tract did not complete a high school diploma. 29% here. So what I have gathered from this map is there are so many things in the state that are overlooked, and many of these things are invisible, right? And we see them in the Des Moines Metro, we see them in Cedar Rapids, this area, 30% of people did not complete a high school degree, 36%, 44%. And so what we see is the same thing sort of over and over again, right? And these people, you might remember the example earlier of low income, near the Drake neighborhood. It was in this area. These things overlap quite a bit. Okay. Is there a shortcut to toggle off all layers? Yes. So you'll come into the map, and it's going to look like it's going to have them all on. All these layers will be turned on. So the shortcut is here. You can turn them all on. It's going to take a second to load because there's so many. And this is what I was getting at, but it makes it easier if you just turn them all off. But that same shortcut, you go here and turn them all off. If you're ever curious about the legend, you can click on it as I've been doing, but you also have a separate thing. So it'll show you what you have toggled on. So PM 2.5 in the air, for example. We'll put that one on. Of course, it's gotta make me look a little bit bad in the presentation. It's gotta happen at least once. Okay, there we go. So you can see the legend there, but you can also click here and it'll tell you the same thing. And it also has the source as well. Okay, so that one's been answered. Can you show how to access the asthma data again? Yeah, and you know what? I'm going to go ahead and leave this PM 2.5 one on. So the way that these are categorized reflect the code book. These are in the same order as this. So I put these two kind of contextual ones, and you can kind of see this one was that red outline for low income. This was the dash marks for a disadvantaged community. In the prior administration, if you were considered as a disadvantaged community, you got access to like extra grants and stuff. So that's why it was really important to have it on there. But then it's, pollution, and then environmental justice, climate, health, and demographic, and then economics. So that's kind of the categorical blocks. So the asthma stuff is here in the health section, and it's current asthma among adults aged greater than 18. And this is a further how they got the data and that sort of stuff is what you'll find in the code book. So knowing that it's further down, we'll just continue to go down. I see some health stuff. Okay, current asthma. So that you just click the box and it'll turn it on. Now it's underneath this PM 2.5 layer though. So if you're going to look at both of them, thinking about it as a sandwich again, that PM 2.5 is the top bun. You're going to have to use this tool to see both of them. So this is PM 2.5 is the brown, asthma is the red. I see Des Moines, so let's go there. You can overlay this. So This is the PM 2.5. When it does the overlay, sometimes it depends on where you click, but 30th percentile for that. And then if I do this, 80th percentile nationally for asthma. So that data comes from self-reported to the CDC, to the American Community Survey, I believe. Okay, yeah, so here's the statewide asthma. Just off the top of my head, having worked on some cancer and the environment things recently, smoking is quite high in these southern counties, more in comparison with others. So look down here at the town, I see that popping up. 57th percentile, 68th, 57th, 57th, yeah. And again, those are national numbers, but the colors show us where in Iowa the asthma rates are the highest. Okay, Iowa Veterans Home is in that area of Marshalltown. I had no idea. Well, thank you for telling me that. That may explain some of the life expectancy. I'm interested in industrial air pollution, wastewater, and electricity in Muscatine County. We've got a community listening session on coal ash in Muscatine tonight, actually, so I'll have some colleagues down in the area. So why am I struggling to find Muscatine? There it is. Okay. So here's the asthma data, if you're curious, but there's that. So Muscatine, and you wanted industrial air pollution. Let's go back up to the pollution category. PM 2.5, not as bad as up in Davenport area, but still up in the 60th-ish percentile. Diesel particulate matter, 34th percent, pretty low nationally. Ozone, this is ground level ozone from industrial facilities, which can be harmful to human health. 61st percentile, pretty in line with the eastern side of the state. Percentile for toxic releases to air, quite high. 84th, 89th, 82nd, 79. Wastewater discharge, and this is from, again, industrial processes or facilities that have to have a wastewater discharge permit. 62nd percentile, 64th, 69th, 68th. And I will note to those of you in Davenport, Muscatine, Cedar Rapids, and Iowa City, we shared this map data with your local community leaders, some of them, whether it was community foundation officials or stormwater utility folks or drinking water folks, to just kind of give them an idea as well. So we got 3 minutes left, so I'm going to try and get through these other ones. Is there any tracking of high and lower respiratory problems due to grain dust at storage facilities? Let me think on that for a second. You know, I haven't heard of like self-reported tracking or anything like that. What I will say is grain dust at storage facilities, if it was leaving the facility, it would be picked up in air monitoring potentially if the air monitor is in the right place as particulate matter, because dust is particulate matter. So I'll just note here in this stretch between Davenport and Muscatine, it's not grain facilities, but you might be able to see them from satellite, actually. I believe they were like right over here along the highway. It's kind of like a dust cloud because there are a number of cement facilities that are present in this area. I want to say it's like somewhere in this area, but it also lines up with the particulate matter being the highest in the state. So that would be my guess. There's not a robust air monitoring network that the state has, but we have helped folks invest in purple air monitors, which are individual sort of citizen science monitors you can buy yourself. So there's that. Thank you, Mary. I hope that this is useful for you. It is being recorded, Tom, so we will share these out on our YouTube page and make sure you get a follow-up email as well. If I wanted this information for the specific spot in Waterloo, how would I receive it? Use this map? Yes, you would be able to do all the things that I just did and share that with your community and dive in even deeper. And if you run into any issues, feel free to send me an email and I'm happy to walk you through it. So with that, we have exactly 1 minute left. We covered a lot of ground, and I am so thankful for your engagement, for your questions. I hope that this map is something you can continue to use in the future. And should you have any challenges in accessing any data, just let me know. The Iowa Environmental Council is happy to be a partner with you in your local efforts. And if we can provide any advice or input, definitely don't hesitate to reach out. So with that, I want to say thanks again, and we'll go ahead and wrap up this afternoon. Thanks.